How did the British East India Company influence the politics and people's lives in Jammu and Kashmir? Hello and welcome to UPSC History View. Today let's learn about the Treaty of Amritsar 1846. The Treaty of Amritsar, executed by the British East India Company and Raja Gulab Singh of Jammu after the First Anglo-Sikh War, established the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir under the suzerainty of the British Indian Empire. The treaty was executed on 16th March 1846. It formalized the arrangements in the Treaty of Lahore between the British East India Company and Raja Gulab Singh of Jammu after the First Anglo-Sikh War. By Article 1 of the treaty, Gulab Singh acquired all the hilly or mountainous country with its dependencies situated to the eastward of the river Indus and the westward of the river Ravi, including Chamba and excluding Lahul, being part of the territories ceded to the British government by the Lahore state according to the provisions of Article 4 of the Treaty of Lahore dated 9th March 1846. Under Article 3, Gulab Singh was to pay 75 lakhs or 7.5 million of Nanak Shahi rupees, the ruling currency of the Sikh Empire, to the British government along with other annual tributes. The Treaty of Amritsar 1846 marked the beginning of Dogra rule in Kashmir. During the First Anglo-Sikh War, Maharaja Gulab Singh Jamwal, he was a Dogra, helped the British Empire against the Sikhs. After the defeat of the Sikh Empire, the Treaty of Lahore on 9th March 1846 and the Treaty of Amritsar 16th March 1846 were signed. As part of the Treaty of Lahore, signed between the 7-year-old Maharaja Dulip Singh, a Sikh, and the British Empire, Jammu was taken over by the British Empire on paper. Article 12 of the Treaty of Lahore stated, in consideration of the services rendered by Raja Gulab Singh of Jammu to the Lahore state towards procuring the restoration of the relations of amity between the Lahore and British governments, the Maharaja hereby agrees to recognize the independent sovereignty of Raja Gulab Singh in such territories and districts in the hills as may be made over to the said Raja Gulab Singh by separate agreement between himself and the British government, with the dependencies thereof which may have been in the Raja's possession since the time of the late Maharaja Khuruk Singh, and the British government, in consideration of the good conduct of Raja Gulab Singh, also agrees to recognize his independence in such territories and to admit him to the privileges of a separate treaty with the British government. Then, as part of the Treaty of Amritsar 1846, Maharaja Gulab Singh Jamwal agreed to serve the British Empire under Article 6, which stated, Maharaja Gulab Singh engages for himself and heirs to join with the whole of his military forces the British troops when employed within the hills or in the territories adjoining his possessions, and in exchange under Article 9, the British government will give its aid to Maharaja Gulab Singh in protection of his territories from external enemies. After which the Dogra served the British Empire in the Indian Rebellion and in various wars. Hence a large percentage of the Kashmiris fought in the First World War and in the Second World Wars, as part of the Jammu and Kashmir state forces and directly with the Royal Navy, the British Army, the Merchant Navy and Gilgit Scouts as mentioned by Major William A. Brown in his book The Gilgit Rebellion 1947. Hence, 1.1 million Kashmiris now live in the United Kingdom. The high taxes to support these wars were resented by all the Kashmiris, including the Hindus, Muslims and the Sikhs, and the combined with the tens of thousands of trained men coming back from the Second World War generated a highly volatile situation in 1947. Lacking the resource to occupy such a large region immediately after annexing portions of Punjab, the British got Gulab Singh pay 75,000 Nanak Shahi rupees for the war indemnity. The angry courtiers of Lahore, particularly the baptized Sikh Lal Singh, then incited the governor of Kashmir to rebel against Gulab Singh. but this rebellion was defeated thanks in great part to the action of Herbert Edwardes, the assistant resident at Lahore. The Kashmiris also rebelled throughout Jammu and Kashmir. To pay for this, from the very start, the Kashmiris were heavily taxed and complained of being sold into slavery, and extensive literature was written by the British writers regarding these treaties. The Slavery Abolition Act 1833 abolished slavery throughout the British Empire. The Slavery Abolition Act 1833 came into force before the Treaty of Amritsar 1846. As far back as 1868 in the book Kashmir Misgovernment, Robert Thorpe stated that the people of Kashmir were sold into slavery to Gulab Singh. Arthur Brinkman in his paper The Wrongs of Kashmir, written in December 1867, also states, he informs the reader of the wretched condition of a people we sold against their inclination and their united cry to us. Arthur Brinkman was an Anglican missionary, and the Anglican Missionary Group had worked with the Anti-Slavery Society to push for the Slavery Abolition Act 1833 a few years earlier. Let's take a look at the Treaty of Amritsar, the text of 1846. The treaty between the British government on the one part and Maharaja Gulab Singh of Jammu on the other, concluded on the part of the British government by Frederick Curie, Esq. And Brevet Major Henry Montgomery Lawrence, acting under the orders of the Right Honour Sir Henry Hardinge, GCB, one of Her Britannic Majesty's most honourable Privy Council, Governor General of the Possessions of the East India Company, to direct and control all the affairs of the East Indies, and by Maharaja Gulab Singh in person, 1846. Article 1. The British government transfers and makes over forever in independent possession to Maharaja Gulab Singh and the heirs male of his body all the hilly or mountainous country with its dependencies situated to the eastward of the river Indus and the westward of the river Ravi, including Chamba and excluding Lahore, being part of the territories ceded to the British government by the Lahore state according to the provisions of Article 4 of the Treaty of Lahore, dated 9th March 1846. Article 2. The eastern boundary of the tract transferred by the foregoing article to Maharaja Gulab Singh shall be laid down by the commissioners appointed by the British government and Maharaja Gulab Singh respectively for that purpose, and shall be defined in a separate engagement after survey. Article 3. In consideration of the transfer made to him and his heirs by the provision of the foregoing article, Maharaja Gulab Singh will pay to the British government the sum of 75 lakhs of rupees, Nanuk Shahi rupees, 50 lakhs to be paid on or before 1st October of the current year, that is 1846. Article 4. The limits of territories of Maharaja Gulab Singh shall not be at any time changed without concurrence of the British government. Article 5. Maharaja Gulab Singh will refer to the arbitration of the British government any disputes or questions that may arise between himself and the government of Lahore or any other neighbouring state, and will abide by the decision of the British government. Article 6. Maharaja Gulab Singh engages for himself and heirs to join with the whole of his military forces the British troops when employed within the hills or in the territories adjoining his possessions. Article 7. Maharaja Gulab Singh engages never to take to retain in his service any British subject nor the subject of any European or American state without the consent of the British government. Article 8. Maharaja Gulab Singh engages to respect in regard to the territory transferred to him the provisions of Article 5, 6 and 7 of the separate engagement between the British government and the Lahore Darbar, dated 11th March 1846. Article 9. The British government will give its aid to Maharaja Gulab Singh in protecting his territories from external enemies. Article 10. Maharaja Gulab Singh acknowledges the supremacy of the British government and will, in token of such supremacy, present annually to the British government 1 horse, 12 shawl goats of approved breed, 6 male and 6 female, and 3 pairs of Kashmiri shawls. This treaty of 10 articles has been to this day settled by Frederick Currie Esk and Brevet Major Henry Montgomery Lawrence, acting under directions of the Right Hon. Sir Henry Hardinge, Governor-General, on the part of the British government, and by Maharaja Gulab Singh in person. And the said treaty has been this day ratified by the seal of the Right Hon. Sir Henry Hardinge, Governor-General. Done at Amritsar, the 16th day of March, in the year of our Lord 1846, corresponding with the 17th day of Rubi-ul-Awal 1262 Hijri. Signed H. Hardinge, seal signed F. Currie, signed H. M. Lawrence. Thank you for listening to this discussion on the Treaty of Amritsar 1846, executed by the British East India Company and Raja Gulab Singh of Jammu. For more such discussions, get the UPSC Practice app from the App Store.